The Lamy 2000 has been an iconic fountain pen since it was introduced in 1966, and it remains an incredibly popular gold nib pen to this day. It's not like most other fountain pens for many reasons, and in this video I want to specifically focus on the nib. The 2000 is known to have sort of a unique nib in the fountain pen world with some special details that are hard to see with the naked eye. So I plan to show you all aspects of these nibs in super close-up detail. What I hope to show you in today's video is exactly what the Lamy 2000 nib looks like, how it writes, what makes it different from other fountain pen nibs, and which nib size might be the one that you want if you're looking to get a 2000 for yourself. I'll make sure to include lots of macro footage and writing samples of the 2000 nibs like I've never shown you before. So let's start out with a quick look at the 2000 and how the nib design is special for it. It's a piston filling pen where the ink is held inside the body of the pen and the nib and the feed are inside the grip of the pen, like most other fountain pens. What's different though is that the grip of the pen is completely seamless to the body, whereas other pens usually have some sort of step or a portion where you can see that the grip is a separate part from the body. So with most other fountain pens, including Lamy, usually the nib is kind of friction fit and will, come out of the pen like this, but not with the 2000 because it's got a hooded nib. So some of the nib is actually inside the grip of the pen here. So you can't even really tell that it's supposed to separate unless you kind of know that it's supposed to do that. It just unscrews, just like that. And then it's got this retainer ring, which is what holds the cap on. This thing wants to pop off, so you got to make sure you keep track of this part because you're going to have to put it back. It almost always wants to come off. And then your whole feed and nib section are going to be in here. I find it's easiest to kind of, take your fingers and pinch it a little bit. You don't want to push the actual tip of the nib, but just pinch it and push mostly on the feed. And you just kind of, break that initial tension, and it's friction fit and it just kind of pulls right out. And you just kind of carefully pull it out and you can see the whole nib and feed together. And the nib looks sort of similar to a regular Lamy nib, but it's not the same as you would have on basically all of the other Lamy pens. Those ones have the wings on it, but it's going to be slightly different in size. So they're not interchangeable, but it definitely looks and feels familiar between the two. And it's got the whole feed mechanism. It's got this little rubber ring on it that helps to just keep it in place as it's on there. It doesn't have anything to do with flow. It just helps to keep that feed in there when it's inside the housing. But yeah, it just allows your ink to flow through these channels. And it comes in here. These fins act as regulators. And then that whole hooded section helps to keep the nib nice and wet and saturated, and then you're able to write with it. But it's a pretty short nib, and you can see this is my thumbnail, and it's smaller than my thumbnail for sure. So not a gigantic nib, but surprisingly springy and nice writing. I wouldn't flex it. I wouldn't, get it for that. I would say it's going to be more on the stiff side, but for what it is, it's pretty surprising. And then, when you're putting it back together, you want to make sure that you have this little crescent moon shape in here that you can see at the end of the grip section. Well, the nib contour has to fit that. And then there's this little channel down here too, which has to match up to the channel that's in the bottom of the feed. So it will sort of naturally want to fit in one particular way. And if you have it wrong, it's only going to go in about this far. You don't want to force it, but you just want to kind of generally get it in the right way. And then you kind of want to just like shift it back and forth a little bit and kind of like wiggle it until it naturally drops into place. It can be a little tough if you're not used to it, but then once it finds its way, it drops right out of there. And then I just kind of give it a gentle little tap. You don't have to push it hard. It'll naturally kind of fit in there. And then you got your retainer ring. That'll go on like that. Just kind of sits in place. And then you take your grip and screw it right onto the body. Tighten that up a bit, and then it's good to go. So that's going to catch us up to speed on the overall nib design and how it fits in the pen, but that doesn't necessarily impact the actual nib size or, the shape of the grind. Basically, all nibs have a number of aspects to their design that impact things like ink flow, the stiffness, the flexibility, how it's going to feel on the page. But perhaps nothing has the most direct impact to the feel of the nib and the way that it puts down ink as the tipping material and how that meets the paper. and how that tip is ground and shaped. So that's where the Lamy 2000 really gets its unique look and feel. So I'm going to spend the rest of this video focusing on the tipping, the grinds, and why the grind on the 2000 nib makes them different from most other pens. Lamy offers several nib sizes on the 2000, but the main four that we've seen regularly imported into the US for over a decade and maybe longer are the extra fine, fine, medium, and broad nibs. Now, we did at one point at gouletpens.com have the opportunity to special order some of the specialty nibs, like a double broad, several different sizes of oblique nibs, but being honest with you, they weren't super popular, and they were kind of hard for us to reacquire, so I'm opting to leave those ones out of this video because I think it's just going to complicate things a bit. I'm going to focus on the four main nibs, which is really what I'm more familiar with anyway, and that's what we'll have available for sale for the foreseeable future. So the 14 karat gold Lamy 2000 nibs are actually solid gold nibs plated in rhodium to give it a silver color. However, that gold is too soft to hold up to the friction of writing on paper. So, like most any other pen, they weld on a much harder wearing ball of precious metal on the end, and then they grind and they polish it to their specifications. And this is where things get pretty interesting on the 2000. So gold nibs with basically every pen brand require handwork at the point of the nib grinding and polishing. It's extremely detailed work, and it's subject to some level of finesse and variation based on the individual nibmeister that's actually doing the work. I myself have had some training sessions with several different nibmeisters. I've done some practice grinding myself, and I will say it's incredibly challenging and detailed work. So before I show the Lamy 2000 grinds, let me show you what I more typically see on other fountain pens using stainless steel Jowo-made German No. 6 nibs like you might find in a variety of different pen models, and that's what we have with our Goulet spare nibs as well. I have the 2000 here on the left, and then I have a Jowo-made extra fine steel nib on the right. So that's, pretty common, pretty popular nib. I know there are different price ranges between these two, but the Jowo are pretty reliable and pretty popular amongst different brands. So I thought it would be good to just show a little bit of the differences of what they look like. So the Jowo is got more of that just overall ball shape, is not, kind of ground flat on the sides like the 2000 is. These are both extra fines. You can see the Lamy 2000 is ground a little finer. You see this a lot with ones where there's just more handwork done, kind of grinding it to a blade point like that. Not quite done so much on the Jowo. So the Jowo is probably going to be a little bit broader in its stroke. And looking at the top, you can see there's more of that ball shape that's just on that Jowo. And there's just a lot more of a mass of a tip there because it probably started out, the Lamy 2000 nib probably started out with this much tipping on it as what you see on the Jowo, but they've done some handwork to kind of grind it down. So a little more refined, a little more intentionally done. And then when you look at the writing pad too, you can see on the 2000 it's got that flat spot. Well, the Jowo is just more rounded in general. So, the Jowo is going to be a little bit more forgiving, but maybe not feel quite as smooth. Instead of being simply a round ball of tipping, they grind this nib into a little bit more of either a blade shape or kind of a square shape. Particularly on the extra fine and fine nibs, you get that blade, you get a little more square on the medium and broad. They're still pretty forgiving in terms of writing angle, but it's going to be a bit more touchy when it comes to the rotation of the pen in your hand. So that more blade-like shape writes great when it's held properly, but if you rotate it too far left or right, then you're going to start to feel a little bit more feedback, and you can start to see some skipping or maybe get some starting issues just a bit sooner than you might on a more rounded nib tipping. If you combine that with the fact that the grip of the pen on the 2000, really lacks any specific shape to it like you would have on a Safari or an All-Star with a triangular grip that really kind of forces you to hold the pen in the right angle and the right rotation, you can get a little bit lost on a 2000 if you don't have a lot of experience with it, and it can take some getting used to. But that's what I plan to show you in this video today, is exactly what's going on with the shapes of these nibs. With the shape of the nib a little bit explained, I think it's about all I can do for you before I actually show it to you. I wanted to write with each of the 2000 nib sizes and talk you through what I'm experiencing and then show you some of these grinds in close-up detail. So I'm going to start with the extra fine. I'm going to work my way up to the broad nib, and I'm going to standardize all of my ink with the Lamy Crystal Azurite, one of my favorites, and I'm going to use Rhodia 80 gram dot paper. So looking at the top of the nib, just the way that it's ground, even on one as fine as an extra fine here, this is the head of a toothpick, if it gives you a sense of just how small we're working here. You can see here they ground the top so it's a little bit flat. It's mostly an aesthetic thing, but it's a nice touch that shows you that there was definitely some handwork that was done with this. Looking at the extra fine from the side, you can also see where they've ground the side here. It's not perfectly round. It makes it a little more blade-like for nib sizes, especially ones like an extra fine. It can help to take the ball that would normally be on the end, and it makes it a little sharper, a little finer nib. And then you can also see here, kind of with the side angle, that you can see the writing pad. So that's this surface here, which is, the pen's kind of upside down right now, but if you had the paper right here, it's got kind of a flat spot right there. That's called the writing pad. Different manufacturers will ground that flatter or rounder than others, but that is one thing that will help it to glide really smooth, and it'll feel, it'll provide more reliable ink flow and stuff like that when it's held at that particular angle. But if you take it off that angle, that's the trade-off, is it might not be quite as reliable. So that is just something that explains a little bit of how this pen writes in particular. And here you can definitely see where it's not just a big round ball. I mean, that's how it started out when they welded it on there. But the weld actually goes all the way down here. The tipping is collected here, but they shave down those sides and really shape that nib. So this is a very, very intentionally ground nib that was done on all four sides to really provide a lot of shape to it, and that's where you're getting this very specific feel to the Lamy 2000. This is something that obviously they're spending a lot of time on and doing very, very specifically for this nib. So here I am writing with the Lamy 2000 with the 14 karat extra fine nib. Personally, I really, really like this nib. The extra fine is one that I usually recommend to people who are a fan of the finer nibs, especially if you're writing like on this 5mm dot grid ruling paper, like on this Rhodia 80 gram here. I have maybe a little bit heavier hand than most, but I'm not giving a lot of pressure here. I'm not trying to flex this out or anything. I am writing with Lamy Crystal Azurite ink, which is a little wetter ink, a little more saturated ink. So you're not seeing quite as much shading here, not that you necessarily would with a fine nib anyway. But even still, you're seeing a little bit of what this ink can offer, a little bit of sheen when I put it down really heavy. The flow is very consistent, very wet on this pen. It's smooth all around, especially if I keep the rotation in mind when writing with this pen. But overall, yeah, very, very positive experience with this nib. Yeah, so with this nib, what I'm finding is that, because it's ground kind of in that blade-like fashion, especially with the extra fine here, I'm finding that I do get a little bit narrower downstroke and a little bit broader cross stroke, which is almost sort of what you get with an architect grind. Now, I wouldn't call this an architect by any means, but it's kind of an effect that happens with this nib. And so, if you're doing things like these X's, some of my cross strokes here going up are going to be a little bit fatter. I'm not pressing any harder or anything. It's literally just, if I do several downstrokes like this, they're going to be fairly thin. And then if I even go in the same direction, if I turn the pen and do it with more of a cross stroke, it's going to look just a little bit broader. So it's subtle, but it is noticeable. And then it's a really, really smooth nib. I like how it feels a lot on the page. It is a little sensitive to writing angle. Like I can write a little finer if I go up with it, but it doesn't feel as good. If I go a really, really steep angle, it doesn't feel as good. It still writes pretty reliably, but it starts to feel a little scratchy and a little, less forgiving on the writing rotation. And if I go really low angle, it'll write a little broader, really low. But because it's so kind of like blade-like shaped and not as round, it'll still write if I over-rotate kind of the pen in my hand, but it feels, I feel a lot more on the paper, and it just feels less stable. It doesn't feel as balanced. So I find that I got to kind of keep it, with that rotation in the hand. I think this is what most people refer to when they say that the 2000 has a sweet spot or something. It's not even necessarily that it performs poorly when you over-rotate it in your hand, but it doesn't feel as smooth, and it just feels like it's kind of like teeter-tottering, like you're losing a little bit of the control if you're not keeping that rotation, constant in your hand. So you gotta get used to that a little bit. But when you do, if you hold it about 45 to 55 degree angle, a little bit on the higher side, you catch that nice flat spot on the nib. It feels really good. You can get some pretty fine lines with it. mostly on the downstroke, but it'll write a little bit broader. I think this is where, if you're writing with a Japanese nib, in an extra fine, it's going to feel a lot finer than this, mainly because of that cross stroke. So it puts down a decent volume of ink. All around, this is a really, really great performing extra fine nib. It's one of my personal favorites and ends up being more of a go-to for me for the Lamy 2000. Now we're looking at the fine nib. Got the same thing going on where you've got that grinding a little bit on the top to give it some shape. If you're thinking that maybe this doesn't look that different than the extra fine, you're pretty accurate. It's not that different. So the extra fine and the fine are not that different from each other. Overall shape is pretty similar. You can see the extra fine is ground a little finer. There's obviously a little more tipping that's taken away there, but I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know for a fact if they use the exact same tipping ball when they weld it on there. I wouldn't be surprised if they did and they just ground a little more away on the extra fine. I find that the two nibs are not that different from each other when you actually put nib to paper. You see there's it's a little bit thinner on that extra fine, so there's clearly some more that's taken away, but it's not super drastic. So I would say if you're kind of looking between these two nibs, it's kind of a coin toss, honestly. All right, now we're moving on to the Lamy 2000 in the fine nib. And personally, I do notice a difference in the feel of the fine nib. The extra fine is pretty darn smooth. The fine nib just feels a little bit smoother though. Not a huge difference in the line width. I think the biggest difference you'll see in the line width is on the downstroke. Whereas on the extra fine, you're getting a little more of that kind of architect blade-like effect where the cross stroke is fatter than your downstroke. On the fine nib though, it's pretty even on both directions, so you don't get quite as much of that effect. This is going to perform a little bit more like just kind of your standard ball tip like you would have on most other pens. So I think if you're a fan of most other fine nibs and you like it to be smooth and generally good even for a 5mm ruling like this, I find the fine to be a very favorable writing nib. If you're not trying to get like the absolute finest writing you can on a 2000, but you still want something that all around is a good performer, the fine is really going to be a good way to go. Then just looking at things like the angle, if I'm writing with a higher angle with the fine nib, doesn't feel as sensitive as it did with the extra fine. Writing with a medium angle, that's definitely a little bit more favorable. Writing with a really low angle, you get a little bit of that kind of just like wobbly, kind of unstable feeling with it, but I'm holding at a pretty unnaturally low angle. Even if I hold with a, like a 35, 40 degree angle, which is about as low as most people, traditionally hold it, still very favorable writing. So I think this one is a little less sensitive to that rotation, but, still going to be good for kind of just your regular rotation in the hand. If I over rotate it a bit, so if I'm going normal here, if I over rotate it a bit, when I get to a certain point where it starts to get kind of thinner, it's still performing pretty well actually. I got to go kind of far with it. It might be more of a feeling thing than an actual performance thing, but all around it's pretty good. Very wet nib. Still, at least with this ink, it's drying pretty well. I know the fine nib I think is an all around just really good nib. If you're not sure which one to go for on this pen, I'll pretty much point you to a fine every time. All right, now with the nib, you can really see what I've mentioned earlier. Got a big flat spot here that's obviously ground by hand. And then looking at the writing pad on the side, looks much more dramatic on the medium nib because there's just a lot more tipping in general. So you got that kind of flat spot on the writing pad, which means it's going to, want to be held at that kind of particular angle. And this is where you can really start to see that you get kind of a flatter writing pad. The way that we kind of describe it here is like it's a little more blocky. It's more kind of ground like a square as opposed to, just a specific ball. So I think that the medium and the broad are really going to show that the best. There we go. Here's the medium 2000 next to the medium steel Yovo. So you can definitely see more of the tipping on the Yovo, that big ball there. It's ground flat on the 2000. When I move it over to the side, now you can see it almost looks like it's got a little bit of point to it on the 2000, which doesn't really affect anything. It just means that if you flipped it upside down and tried to write with it, you would get a really sharp point writing there. You got much more of just a general ball shape going on with the Yovo. So what that means is holding this at the steeper writing angle, the 2000 is going to be a little more forgiving. It's going to feel smoother and flatter, but again, with that kind of squared off look, if you go with the rotation that's a little further off, then you are going to, not necessarily going to be, quite as forgiving as you would with this more rounded Yovo tip. All right, now we're getting to the medium. And this is where you definitely start to notice a difference with the nibs. Noticeably broader than the fine. Definitely a bigger jump going from the fine to the medium than there is going from the extra fine to the fine. Feels very smooth. I would say if you are more of a fan of the smoother, broader nibs, you like to have a more generous ink flow, you're really a fan of shading and sheening and shimmer and things where you're really drawing out more of those richer, deeper characteristics of the ink, then I would say you should be looking more towards a medium nib, maybe even a broad, but we'll get to that. Medium nib, I think, is a great balance, a very wet writing nib, very broad in size. It's pretty even on its strokes between the cross and the downstroke. So even though it's got kind of that squared off grind, it still performs really, really well. It's got just an amazing feel to it. I think because they grind that writing pad a little flatter, I think you're gonna get, honestly, a really great feeling nib on the page. And it's gonna get a lot of ink coverage down there too. So you get a really cool kind of effect with the ink as it writes, and it just feels really good. All right, then looking at things like the writing angle, if I hold it at a little bit steeper angle, it's gonna, it's gonna get a little wobbly. It's gonna write thinner and stuff like that. And because it's got kind of that square effect, it feels a little less comfortable. It's not scratchy or anything, but the line like width and the ink flow and stuff like that gets a little wonky when you hold it at a really, really high angle. I find that if you hold it closer to like a 60, 70 degree angle, that's where it starts to really hit that sweet spot. And, then you're going to get really generous flow. If I go really, really low, still writes really wet and smooth, but that's where I'm gonna lose some of that kind of sense of feeling in the rotation there. So it's got a pretty broad range, honestly, and I think that in terms of the writing angle, it's gonna be fine for the vast majority of people that use it, which is why I think we don't really hear a lot of complaints about it. But it wants to write in that sweet spot in terms of the rotation. If I am rotating it, if I'm writing it with it straight up and down, it's gonna feel really good. If I rotate it more like this, it still writes fine, but it feels like I'm kind of like, I don't know, taking a corner too fast on a car. It kind of feels like I'm like weighted heavier on one side, and I could see if I'm not paying attention to rotation, where it's going to change the feel. It still doesn't make it scratchy though, because it's pretty well rounded. But I don't know, maybe I'm being too harsh on the rotation thing. It's more of a feeling thing than it is like an actual like ink performance. But when I do bring it back to its natural kind of state, oh man, it feels really great. So the medium, I think if you don't want to go so wet as a broad, but you want to really show off the ink a lot and want a really smooth nib, then the medium is going to be the one for you. This was the first nib size that I ever had on a 2000, and it gave me a very, very favorable introduction. So I don't think it's a bad way to go if that's your thing. The broad is going to show everything in the most dramatic fashion here because it's the biggest tip, biggest nib. You got the most grinding surface to work with. So this one, almost looks like a stub, but it's not. It's just a really kind of squared off broad. So they do grind it flat there, and then they, you can tell they even grind it flat. They kind of blunt the tip of it a little bit. Again, neither of these are touching the paper, so it doesn't affect the writing, but it's definitely visibly noticeable even with the naked eye. I'm just showing you really close up here. Now you can see where they're actually taking some extra steps. So they're grinding the side, they grind the top like this, they're smoothing out the writing pad, but then they're also grinding this part right here, just to kind of, so it doesn't have that pointy thing like you had going on with the medium. I don't know if they do that with all the broads, but they definitely did with this one. And you can see here, it's not a perfectly round ball, so it'll be pretty forgiving, but if you hold this at a really low writing angle, it's not going to write quite as broad as it will if you have it, a little higher angle like this. So it does seem the 2000s kind of prefer to be written with a higher angle based on these grinds. Then you can definitely see here sort of that like blocky kind of look to it that it's got. That's the way they grind it. So, I like it. Aesthetically, it's very cool. It's very unique to the 2000, and it's a lot of handwork. So you can just tell they're taking a lot of time on these. And then the broad is going to really showcase the differences here between the 2000 and the Ovo steel nib. So very significant ball going on with the Ovo steel. Again, it's probably not that dissimilar from how the 2000 started out, except you can tell they've taken a bunch of extra steps to grind it down and shape it up to look like what the 2000 looks like now. So looking at the writing pad kind of from the side here, you can tell that the 2000 nib is gonna be a little smoother, probably a little perform a little more what you would expect when it's held at a slightly higher angle, just because of that writing pad right at the top there, whereas the Jowo one is more rounded and would probably do better at a little lower writing angle. So just something interesting based on how it's shaped. There you go, and you can tell there's some additional shaping going on with the writing pad, on this part, because ultimately this is the part that's touching the paper, the part that we're looking at right now. So that's actually what matters the most. The rest of it is somewhat aesthetic and stuff like that, but the angle of the writing pad, how smooth it is, how much of a ball shape it is, that's going to be the biggest impact on how a pen is going to write. And you can tell the 2000's got a very kind of specific way that it's done, as opposed to the just much more overall rounded shape that you would have on a Jowo. So you're going to look at the regular Lamy gold nib, also ground flat on the top there, but the shape is going to be a little bit different. Writing pad is a little more forgiving on that and a little more rounded, whereas on the 2000 it's a little more squared off, and it's going to do better at a little higher writing angle. So these are two gold Lamy broad nibs, but you can tell they grind them a little different on the 2000 versus just their regular 14 karat nib like you would have on their other pens. And now you can see close up how they differ. All right, now we're moving on to the big guns here. The 2000 broad nib. Now this nib feels so smooth. If you're going for the smoothest feeling nib, the broad is definitely the way to go. It's just so much surface area, especially with the writing pad, the way they grind this thing, it just glides across the page. It feels really, really good. I really like the feel of this a lot. It's definitely wet, and it's definitely putting down plenty of ink, but look at some of the shading that you're getting, some of the sheen that's starting to come out on an ink like this as you write. It's really this nib is gonna show off your ink better than any other Lamy 2000 nib, hands down. It gets a little tight on the 5mm ruling on this dot grid, but it's not unusable. Now I am skipping lines here. If I was trying to fit all my writing, on every 5mm line here, it would be a little tight and it'd be a little bunched up. So maybe not the thing if you got really fine ruling and all that kind of stuff, if you're doing bullet journaling and all that, but I do think it's very, very comfortable pen for lots of long writing, especially if you have more generous ruling. And this one is not going to be quite as sensitive in terms of its angle. Even if I'm holding it at a pretty steep angle, it actually still writes pretty reliably. Maybe just a teensy bit finer, but it's still quite smooth. It doesn't really feel scratchy or anything. So I think if you do have a really high writing angle, this pen is probably the most favorable of any of the grinds in that way. However, when I drop it down more into that nice writing pad sweet spot, it feels really good. And then if I go really low with it, it's not really that bad. It's pretty forgiving. I think this, because you got such a big tip on here, it's going to be very, very forgiving in terms of your writing angle. And then in terms of the rotation, because you have the biggest writing pad here, it's not going to be unlike a stub, not quite as dramatically, but it will be a little more sensitive to the rotation. So, you do have to kind of watch out for that a little bit. I'm even getting, you can just see how much weaker that's writing as I'm kind of over rotating in my hand. You can get a little skipping and stuff like that. But I'm going pretty dramatic with it. I think, in all my writing with it, I've never really had a problem. But, something to take into account. But gosh, just look at how flowy that is, how wet that is. It's just an absolute joy to write with. And if you're an ink fan, this is going to be the nib for you. All right, and then just so I can give you a comparison across all the 4 nib sizes, going from extra fine all the way to broad, you can see the difference here. Extra fine and fine, not a drastic difference, maybe a little bit on that cross and downstroke, but overall, not the biggest difference. Once you jump up to that medium though, it's a whole different ball game. And then the broad is just even more. So yeah, I think honestly, there's no wrong way to go with any of these nibs. It just is a matter of what you prefer. There you go, very comprehensive video on the Lamy 2000 nibs. Please let me know what you think of this one, and if you have any other pens that you would like me to see do a similar comprehensive nib analysis on, please let me know in the comments. You can check out these pens and lots of other great fountain pen stuff at gouletpens.com. I'm Brian Goulet. Thank you so much for watching, and write on.